Stanford University.
Thank you all so much. First of all, thank you to President Hennessy for those wonderful remarks, your vigorous support for Cardinal Service, and your great leadership of Stanford University over these past 15 years. The Haas Center for Public Service is honored to be co-sponsoring this reunion forum with the Stanford Alumni Association. Over the past 30 years, civic engagement to expand access to education, healthcare, justice, and economic opportunity has been a predominant theme of the Haas Center's public service programs and fellowships. This is a time of growing concern in the United States and in many other countries about economic inequality, persistent poverty, and barriers to opportunity for significant segments of the population. In this panel today, we want to reflect on the nature, scope, and causes of these problems. In particular, we're going to discuss some policy solutions and non-governmental initiatives that can reduce poverty and inequality and expand opportunity and upward mobility for people in the United States and around the world. And we want to think about what Stanford is doing and can do to address these challenges. So we have a great panel of Stanford faculty members. Let me introduce them, if you don't mind, in alphabetical order. So we'll start with Michelle Anderson, who's a professor of law, a specialist on urban policy, city planning, local democracy, and public finance. Her work combines legal analysis with details of human experience to understand the local governance of high poverty areas, both urban and rural, and the legal causes of concentrated policy and fiscal crises. She's working on a new book now with the tentative title, Living Places, Dying Governments.
Looking for a better title.
Next is my colleague at Hoover, Michael Boskin, who's the Tully M. Friedman Professor of Economics and a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. He served, as I think many of you know, as chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors from 1989 to 1993. He's chaired the Commission on the Consumer Price Index, whose 1996 report has transformed the way government agencies around the world measure inflation, GDP, and productivity. And over many years, he's been a wonderful mentor to many of our Haas Center students. Francis Fukuyama is director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and Olivier Nomalini Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. His recently completed 2-volume work on political order traces the history of the modern state and the means by which societies develop impersonal, accountable, and effective institutions of governance. Caroline Hawksby, also my colleague at Hoover, is Scott and Danya Baumer Professor in Economics and Senior Fellow both at the Hoover Institution and SIEPR, the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. A public and labor economist, she's widely known for her research on school choice, school finance, the market for college education, peer effects, and university finance and financial aid. Finally, Jesper Sorensen is the Robert A. and Elizabeth R. Jeffy Professor in the Graduate School of Business, where he serves as faculty director of one of the most exciting initiatives on campus now, the Stanford Institute for Innovation in Developing Countries, known by the acronym SEED. His research focuses on the dynamics of both organizations and careers, with work that covers topics ranging from firm performance to social inequality. So thank you, our diverse and accomplished panelists, for agreeing to participate in this forum. Now, I want to begin by trying to assess where we're at. Let's talk about what you each see to be the noteworthy trends, or even perhaps misconceptions, about the nature and extent of inequality and poverty. How would you characterize the situation today and the trends in recent years? And how should we think about inequality? Is it only an economic problem, or it does have other dimensions as well? So Caroline, why don't we start with you?
Okay, so I thought I would get started by making sure we have some facts so that we're all on the same page to some extent, and then talking about the big causes of changes in both our income distribution in the United States and also around the world. So just a couple of facts to get us started. People talk a lot about income mobility or intergenerational mobility. Although you may have heard that that's changed in the United States, it's really been very stable since 1950. So there's not a lot to talk about there. In terms of inequality, income inequality, when economists measure after-tax income inequality, which is what we want to measure, it has been increasing in the US over the last 15 years, but it's been increasing almost exclusively above the 90th percentile. That means just the top 10% of earners in the United States have experienced increasing inequality. Actually, for people who are below median income, inequality has been decreasing for the past 15 years. So that's important because when we're thinking about poverty and people who are of modest incomes, the inequality that they've experienced, they've actually been getting closer and closer to the median person. Well, now, what are the causes of changes in the income distribution both here and around the world? Actually, it doesn't have that much to do with government policy, and I know that Michael Boskin is going to talk about this more, so I won't go into that. But what are the two big causes? One of them is technology, and the other one is globalization. So now, how does this work? Technology, the sort of technological innovations that we have today, are substitutes for routine labor, people sewing things on sewing machines, things like that. And they are complementary to what we call abstract skills, abstract thinking, in other words, very educated people. And therefore, technology has a tendency to make very educated people more productive and have higher earnings, and it has a tendency to do the reverse to people who have what we would call unskilled skills or just routine types of skills. So that's a very big force in the world, not just here, but all over the world. The second big force is globalization. Globalization is the opening up of many countries to trade. And globalization forces all countries towards their comparative advantage. Well, in the US, we do not have comparative advantage in any of the industries that depend on unskilled labor or routine labor because so many other countries in the world have an abundance of unskilled labor and it's much cheaper than our unskilled labor. So we will never have comparative advantage in those types of industries again. Instead, our comparative advantage is in industries that require skilled labor, in industries that require advanced manufacturing technologies, and in some natural resources like these days natural gas. But mostly you want to think about our industries requiring a lot of skill. So now what does this imply for inequality or for the income distribution of the United States? It implies that if we want to have equality in incomes, we need to try to get many, many Americans to become very skilled people. Because our industries are wonderful industries in some ways. They generate very high incomes if you can be productive in those industries. They don't generate a lot of pollution for the most part. Finance doesn't generate a lot of pollution. Software development doesn't generate a lot of pollution. Okay, higher education is one of our big industries, doesn't generate a whole lot of pollution. In fact,
Less now than
even less now. Yes, that's right. So, so we have great industries. I mean, I would prefer these industries than most of the other industries in the world. But we need to have Americans have the skills to participate productively in these industries, and that means that we need education, which is something I'm going to talk about later. If we do not do that, if we do not manage to get most Americans up to the skill level to participate productively, then what we're going to have is some small share of Americans working very productively in these industries, earning high earnings, and trying to support the rest of Americans either not working at all or not working productively enough to live without government subsidies. So they will be dependent on government disability programs and welfare programs and negative income taxes and Medicaid and things like that. That's not a very sustainable economic program. But I also think it's just not a program that is conducive to human dignity or conducive to civil society when one half of the country works and the other half of the country is dependent on them. So I think that's where I'll stop and maybe turn over.
Great. Okay, Michael, how do you look at this?
Well, thanks. First of all, let me say it's always a thrill to be speaking to our wonderful alums, and especially for me, for some of my former students who I know are in the audience. Let me start by agreeing with what Caroline said and reinforcing a couple of parts of it. As typically measured, inequality has been increasing in almost every country that we measured in. Secondly, labor's share of income has been declining relative to capital share of income in most of the countries we measured in, both developed and developing, with all the measurement problems. Third, if we look rather than within countries at the entire world, and we ask what's happened to inequality, it's plummeted. The world is far more equal now than it was 15, 20, 30 years ago. And there are many reasons for these forces. Caroline mentioned technology and globalization. A complementary way to think about it is with Deng Xiaoping's opening of China, Rajiv Gandhi's reforms a decade later, which partly desocialized India, the collapse of the former Soviet Union. We've added over 1 billion workers able to compete in the global marketplace producing traded goods. And that has put downward pressure on wages in the advanced economies of all, as Caroline mentioned, but the most skilled workers. That's a big force. And is it a good or bad thing? It's obviously more politically salient that inequality has been rising within countries. But it's important to think about what would have happened if we had suppressed technology, if we had if we had suppressed trade, and ask yourself, would it have been a good or bad thing? First, you have to ask, what would have happened to the level of income in the United States or anywhere else? And almost certainly it would be lower for lots of people, not just the people at the top. Secondly, you have to ask yourself, would have been great to have prevented 300 million Chinese from being lifted out of abject poverty, in addition to other people around the world. Even Africa has been improving a lot in the last 10 or 15 years. That's the greatest transformation of the human economic condition in world history. It's the largest and most rapid, even viewed as a percentage of the population, not just in the absolute numbers. So those are great things, but they've been big drivers of these issues in the income distribution. I would also argue that in addition to talking about inequality, one of the reasons it's become so salient in the political discourse is that incomes have risen very slowly, properly measured, not at all if you use the official measures, slowly if properly measured, for a large fraction of the population of the United States. And what does that mean? People are upset. And there are many reasons for this. In recent years, since the recession, the financial crisis and recession, we've had the most anemic recovery since World War II. Incomes have been growing at about half the speed as they grew out of other deep recessions in the 70s and early 80s, at which point in the early 80s, by the way, unemployment was higher than it was at the worst of the Great Recession. So I view the big issues as getting growth up, expanding skills, and we'll talk, I think, in the next round about how to do that. I think Caroline's exactly right, focusing on getting a much higher percentage of our population skilled to be able to compete in the global marketplace. That'll obviously take some time, and we'll talk about some other policies in the next round.
Great. So, Michelle, from the perspective of your work on the depleted inner cities and some of the impoverished rural areas, or more broadly, analytically, how do you look at these problems?
Well, I thought that I would make some broader comments this morning about concentrated poverty. Some of the numbers, in particular, the number that I continue to find stunning, that 1 in 5 Californians live below the poverty line, which for California is defined as $25,000 to $30,000 a year for a family of 4. And that's too many Californians living under that poverty line. So we could talk a lot about poverty, but I thought instead I would just tell you a little bit about Stockton, one of the many cities that I've researched. As you know, we've come through a major wave of not only municipal bankruptcies, but fiscal collapse in cities and rural areas across the country. And Stockton, just 2 hours from here, is one of them. And Stockton is really an extraordinary window into the title of this panel, I think, because it symbolizes many of the dynamics that you've already heard about and will hear about, essentially the automation and globalization of jobs that leave behind a low-skilled workforce competing for low-wage jobs that are increasingly insecure and scarce. And the enormous concentration of poverty in Stockton is a very long-term phenomenon. It is both the sort of one of the big hubs of California agriculture, and it is a former military town. It is in some ways no different than the northern suburbs of St. Louis that we have seen captured in recent times. the city of Detroit, Eastern Oregon, et cetera. It's symbolic of a lot of post-industrial places across the country. But in California, we had this big run-up in the housing boom, in housing values that felt like a recovery in cities like Stockton. And then, as everybody knows, Stockton then became a story of the foreclosure crisis, an infamous story of the collapse in the housing market. Families in Stockton, the average housing prices lost 66% of their value in the housing crash. So to put that in numbers, that was average house prices of about $500,000 coming down to $170,000. And when Stockton then slumped into bankruptcy as this individual financial crisis became a citywide fiscal crisis because property tax revenues were in the doldrums, the city slumped into bankruptcy, and the bankruptcy judge described in very poignant terms the trail of misery of the individual bankruptcies that had been coming through his court as part of this financial collapse. So Stockton goes into bankruptcy court, and what happens across the recession is slashing cuts to the public sector, like all of the places that I have researched, slashing cuts in which basically all programs outside of emergency, sort of frontline dispatch, police, fire, and teachers are cut, and even policing in Stockton was cut 40% as the homicide rate in the city is spiking and spiking and spiking. They're doing these massive rounds of layoffs. I took a group of Stanford law students to Stockton just last fall of 2014, and residents there described to me how the police department just deploys what is essentially a no blood, no dispatch policy. The resident put it that if you call 911, unless there is quote unquote a body down, you cannot get a police officer. We were standing having that conversation directly across from what they refer to locally as an open air drug market, essentially a tolerated open air place for drug sales that the police cannot worry about because there's too much violent crime in the city. So that's the sort of the hemorrhaging of the public sector. And actually, it's so important to remember this is a rural story too. I can't resist, and this will be the last thing I'll say, sort of coming back to the Umpqua Community College shootings in Douglas County, Oregon, which is also a place, rural Oregon has suffered tremendously in the competition for global timber and the automation of paper mill jobs. And the Douglas County Sheriff described the inability of the government there to even enforce gun control law. He said, "Our budget is continuously shrinking to the point that there are times when we have a difficult time simply responding to domestic disturbances, vehicle crashes, the ordinary calls for service that happen every day. To expect local law enforcement to run down and do an investigation into whether or not an individual, a private individual, has conducted a background check is nearly impossible." So this is, it is a long story. We did not, the recovery has not reached the lower levels of the individual income distribution, and it has not reached the places of rising concentrated poverty. Since 2000, we have 25% more cities and counties that are chronically and intensively poor. So it leaves us with really important questions, not just about whether rising wealth is responsible for concentrated poverty in some kind of causal sense, but even if we suspend that question, it leaves us with incredibly important questions of whether rising wealth is responsible to that lasting tail of concentrated poverty. So.
And I'll just add that one of our real star public service students of the last decade, Michael Tubbs, is a member of the City Council of Stockton.
He met with my students. He was, yes.
So he's really in the grip of struggling with these challenges in Stockton. Frank, how do you look at and think about these challenges?
Well, I think, first of all, you've got to think about poverty and inequality in broader terms simply than income, because it's also a matter of culture and values. Now, in my humble opinion, the last time the nation had a serious discussion about the sources of poverty and inequality was in the 1980s, when there was a quite polarized debate. On the one hand, largely about inner city poverty between people like William Julius Wilson, Charles Murray, Sarah McClanahan, quite a few academic participants in this. And it in a way started with the 1965 Moynihan Report. Daniel Patrick Moynihan issued a report on the Negro family in which he pointed out that poverty among African Americans was also highly related to the breakdown of families. And this led to a discussion about whether it's basically structure, meaning economic opportunity, or culture or values that was responsible for this. Liberals tended to say that it was a matter of absent jobs, deindustrialization. Conservatives pointed to the collapse of traditional family values, not just among the poor, but this was a period where there's a huge amount of social change, the sexual revolution, the rise of feminism, and so forth. But I think it had a very important policy impact, which was in 1976, the passage of the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, otherwise known as welfare reform, which President Bill Clinton and the Republican Congress agreed on.
That was
because
96?
96 it was passed. And it was based on this view that actually welfare itself, this was the aid to families with dependent children, this Depression-era program that gave support to single mothers, was actually breeding dependence because it would only give the benefit to a woman if she was not married. And so there was an agreement among Republicans and Democrats to end that program, replace it with something called Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, TANF. And then I think we stopped talking about it. Now, fast forward to the present, 30 years after that debate in the 1980s, what's happened? If you look at what you might call the upper class of the United States, meaning people with a bachelor's education or higher, in terms of those social indicators, actually things have gotten a lot better. The divorce rate peaked in the 1980s. It's been coming down slightly ever since then. The number of children born to in single-parent families has held steady at 6, 7, 8%. Self-reported happiness in families has increased. Social trust has declined for everybody, but in this group, it's not bad. So there's a lot of very good indicators, and in fact, the big problem for a group like this is not absent parents, but helicopter parents. That, they're spending too much time with their kids. On the other hand, if you look at people with a high school education or lower, the last 30 years have been an utter disaster on every single one of these indicators. So the most striking one is single-parent families. So back in the 1980s, the rate of single-parent families in the African-American community had reached about 70%. Today, for the white working class in the United States, that figure is at about 60%. 60% of all children are growing up in a single-parent family. And then all of the associated ills that we connected to inner cities, primarily with African Americans, are now generally characteristic of the white working class. So crime, drug use, teenage pregnancy, whites in rural Indiana take meth rather than smoke crack cocaine, so the kind of drug is different, but it's an epidemic, and it's one that's largely invisible, I think, to the college-educated elites in this country. And so I think that we are at this point where we need to revive that debate that we had in the 1980s, because it does seem to me that there are both structural causes and there's also a really important cultural dimension in the kinds of values. I mean, because the culture is really, it's the family that transmits, the family and neighborhood transmit positive social values of work, thrift, integrity to generations. And I don't think that you're capturing the kind of crisis that the bottom half of the income distribution in the United States is in, unless you pay attention to that.
And it may actually be easier now to have this conversation if we're talking about it broadly as a kind of class phenomenon rather than as it emerged.
Well, we'll see
during
about that. We'll get
those
to that.
days when it was suggested that it was patterned largely along racial lines. Jesper, what about you?
So thank you, and thank you, Larry, for letting me go last. So I have, but I actually, so I find myself in a somewhat odd position because, well, in part because a lot of the things that I would have said have been already mentioned, which I think is great, because I think that means that there's a lot of commonality. So I'm sort of here with my hat on as the director of what we call SEED, so the Stanford Institute for Innovation in Developing Economies, and what we're focused on is poverty in developing countries, right? And so that's really what our target is. And in that sense, a lot of the facts that you see here, when we focus on what are the consequences of the changes over the last 30 to 40 to 50 years, right, for inequality in the United States been, right, a lot of those, as Caroline mentioned, are driven by globalization. And so there's a flip side to it, right, which is there has, if you look at other countries in the world, especially what we call developing economies, right, there has been a dramatic change, right, in particular in the extent of poverty, right? And so one of the most remarkable facts, and you can quickly look on the internet and find lots of, data visualizations that'll illustrate this, but I think, it's real data and it's a real trend, is just a dramatic decline in the proportion of the global population that falls below an absolute poverty line. And to a large extent, that is essentially what Caroline described as, right, lots of countries out there that have a supply of unskilled labor, right, for manufacturing and other kinds of production processes that has really transformed a lot of lives in there. And so I think that's kind of the first trend that I would point to as kind of being really important, because I think one thing that it implies for us in the way we talk about approaches to inequality is that we really have to, our natural instinct is to think about this at the community level and at the national level, and I think there are really important and good reasons to think about that, but there are also global implications, right, for whatever we do locally, and so it's an important set of trade-offs that we have to think about. The other important kind of trend that I would point to is something that Michael, I think, mentioned, right, is if you look at kind of average GDP per country, or per capita across countries, right, again, across the last 50 or so years, right, you again see a remarkable shift in the distribution. And what the way the distribution has changed is essentially, it used to be sort of bimodal, right? So there were two humps to the distribution. There were a lot of very low-income countries, and there were a smaller number, but concentrated kind of high-income countries. And really what you've seen is a shift more towards a more unimodal kind of distribution. So there's just, there's a lot more countries that have moved towards the middle, right? And then again, that's a consequence of a lot of the globalization changes that Caroline mentioned, but I think it's also, right, points to the importance of differences across countries, right, and how they have been able to take advantage of these different kinds of developments, right? And really the importance in particular, right, we oftentimes talk about the East Asian miracle and so on and so forth, that it wasn't so much a miracle as it was, a state-led kind of process to a large extent that kind of kick-started things, right? And so the challenge that we see at SEED is then thinking about the countries where you haven't seen that kind of change yet, right? So we operate a center in Ghana, and one of the remarkable things that I just think is fascinating is if you go back to 1950 and you compared average GDP per capita in Ghana versus in South Korea, Ghana was actually a little bit ahead of South Korea at that time. And they're nowhere close to each other anymore, right? South Korea is by far, it's multiples of what GDP per capita is in Ghana, right? And I think Frank would probably agree that a lot of that is around, right, the various kinds of social institutions and political institutions, and Larry, I know, is an expert in this as well, right, that have enabled that kind of transition, right? And so I think one of the real challenges is to make sure that in these environments where there are weaker states and where there are weaker institutions for creating that kind of growth, right, how do you find ways to unlock that potential, right? Because there is that potential. There's a lot of talk about, manufacturing, you know, if you talk to people who do manufacturing, especially kind of low-cost manufacturing processes, China's already too expensive, right? Vietnam is already too expensive, right? And so everybody talks Africa is the next place where manufacturing will kind of grow, but actually making that happen and having that be realized is a really big challenge, because the institutional environments are very different, and the challenges of making that happen are really very different.
Great, and we look forward, I believe, next Thursday to hosting the president of the World Bank, Jim Kim, for an important speech and a day-long conference that the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies will be hosting with the SEED program, where I think he'll be elaborating on much of what you said, and with a particular focus on the health challenge. Okay, one thing that distinguishes you all is you're not just scholars, but you think about and are engaged in the policy process. Several of you have been in government or advised governments. So both from a kind of government policy side and more broadly in terms of other societal innovations, the big question that I think everybody in the room wants to hear is what can be done about these problems? What are some promising or desirable responses? Michael, why don't we start with you?
Well, thanks, Larry. Let me just quickly add to something Jesper said about institutions being important with the example he gave. In the 1970s, the price of Ghana's main export crop went up more than the price of oil during the oil shocks. And its GDP went down because it collectivized its farms. So that's a stark example of institutions mattering a lot. I think that we have a broad menu of things we have to do in policy, but the very first thing is to get wages rising. We need to have stronger macroeconomic growth. And that will benefit the bottom 90% that hasn't benefited so much, and where we have this issue of wage stagnation and not benefiting as much from the recent economic performance. There are many ways to do that. I want to just focus on three. If you take economists, what we think we know about economic growth, growth will increase if we increase productivity, which in turn increases with technology and capital formation. It will increase if we have a more skilled labor force, education, but other types of skills, training heavily in the private sector and an experience on the job if you get on the economic ladder and have an opportunity to move up, but also government programs. And finally, the wide range of policies we have that it affects this, but also translate the market distribution into the after-tax and after-transfer payment part of, or measure of inequality or of income. To get growth up, I think there are a variety of pretty obvious things to do. They may be something that doesn't sound sensible to deal with inequality at the start, but I would say the most important thing we could do to increase growth, which has been lagging primarily because business investment has been lagging, would be to improve our tax system. And there, most of the discussion in the political process has been in the personal tax, but the United States has the highest corporate tax rate in the world. It's 50% higher than the OECD average and higher still than some of our important competitors. And that winds up heavily being borne by American labor, both in the fact that the less capital formation means workers are less productive, and secondly, by the fact that we wind up having activity located abroad, which just as well could be here. So I think reform of the corporate tax, we have to get the rate down and move to what's called a territorial system. Right now, there's $2 trillion on American multinational corporations' balance sheets sitting abroad, because if they bring it home, they'll pay the difference between the tax they paid where the income was produced and the higher American rate. So no board of directors would be living up to its fiduciary responsibilities to do that and pay these massive taxes. So taxes, and we need to improve our transfer payment system so that we actually do have a solid safety net, and one that can temporarily expand when necessary at a time of severe and long-lived recessions, for example, but then titrates down sensibly more quickly than it did in this last time, and gives people incentives to get back to work and not to be in a situation where their incomes are almost as high if they stay on these programs and if they go to work and start paying taxes and losing benefits. So those are some of the things in that regard. and then I'll leave education for Caroline to talk about because I know she wants to focus on that. So that's getting income up and dealing with the tax transfer system. I want to talk just for a moment about government programs, particularly since we're talking about the Haas Center, and we send a lot of what we're trying to imbue a sense of public service is something that's important to do in some time in your career. President Reagan used to say that democracy is not a spectator sport, and I would agree with that from my own experience. So there I want to just give an example of how our government is counterproductive. We have 100 anti-poverty programs. In combination, the phasing out of benefits as you go to work for people on multiple programs can produce a tax rate of 100%. More than twice the federal rate, maybe half when you include California's tax, double the tax rate of our successful small businesses and higher income people in California. So that doesn't give you a lot of incentive to get into the labor market. It has massive duplication in housing and all these programs that are dealing with some of this breakdown in families and intense poverty that Frank and Michelle talked about. But also, just to give you one example, American companies, even after the recovery's gone on and the unemployment rates finally come down, by the way, accelerating once the substantial expansion and extension of unemployment benefits ended, the unemployment rate started to come down more rapidly. It's important to note that when you take a look at American firms right now list several million job openings for people with skills that they can't find. This isn't software engineers, it's tool dyers, lathe operators, things like that. We have 46 separate job training programs in the federal government, over 9 agencies costing $20 billion a year. Someone really needs to get in all these programs, consolidate them into a few good ones that work, get rid of the ones that don't work, and wind up producing a lot more value and a lot more help for our citizens who actually need it, and measure that as the outcome, not as the amount spent and the number of different programs with a congressman or a senator's name on it.
Great. Well, Michael has mentioned education. Everybody seems to agree that improving human capital is just crucial to relieving these problems, Caroline. So what do we do about that?
So I promise you that I will get to some solutions.
Okay.
But I first want to talk about what we've been doing for the past 40, 45 years and what appears to be not a solution, because I think that's as important as anything else because it helps define what we should be thinking about going forward. So since 1970, when we really started to gather very good data on both student achievement and per pupil spending in the United States, per pupil spending in real inflation-adjusted terms has gone up by 400%. Okay, so it costs us now 4 times as much to educate an American student in the public schools as it did in 1970. That's a very, very big increase. We now have the most expensive public school system in the world, bar sometimes Norway is more expensive, or Luxembourg, if you count Luxembourg as a country. Anyway, so
Can I just ask, where's it going? Because everyone's complaining about poor teacher pay. So where's this money going?
well, that's a great question, and we will go there. We will absolutely, positively go there. And I wanted to trigger questions like that. Okay, that's why I started with that. The other thing I want you to know is over the past 45 years, the inequality in per pupil spending between rich families in the United States and poor families in the United States has decreased dramatically. So that right now, if you look at per pupil spending, it is approximately flat across the US income distribution. Rich families and poor families have about equal spending in their schools. In fact, in about half of our states, students from poor families have more spent on their schools than students in richer families. And it depends on the state, because everything is a state level thing here. Now, over these 45 years, you might say, well, okay, we've equalized spending, and it's much higher on average. What's happened to student achievement? Well, student achievement has essentially not budged since 1970. It's just about the same. It's marginally higher. It's not lower, okay, to be clear. It's not lower, but it's just marginally higher. And furthermore, the gap between the highest achieving students and the lowest achieving students in the United States has remained about the same. So that student achievement has just stayed in exactly the same place while we have changed how much we spend on our public and also our private schools, but especially our public schools, which dominate K through 12 education in the United States. So unless you think that a 46th year of doing more of the same is going to change things, and I'm not that optimistic. I mean, I try to be an optimist, but I'm not that optimistic. It has to be a different set of things than that in the past. And I also just mentioned some of the things that people think are the obvious things. For instance, reductions in class size. That is one of the ways in which we've spent the money. So if that's your favorite policy, we've had 45 years of trying it. You're an eternal optimist. We also have spent increasingly on early childhood education in the United States. That does not appear to be a silver bullet either. We have spent less on it than we have spent in K-12 education. But for instance, the most recent rigorous randomized control trials of early kindergarten, pre-kindergarten education in Tennessee, and also the big randomized control trials about the Head Start program have suggested that they have at most extremely modest effects. In fact, Head Start appears to be sort of 0 after grades 1 or 2. So we do not have, it is not a simple, there's no simple answer to this question. And yet, as I said earlier, we must improve student achievement in the US. This is absolutely the one thing we must do. If we are marching into a future, whether we like it or not, in which technology and globalization are going to really punish Americans who do not have skills. And so we have to solve this problem. This is not something where we can say, well, gee, it's just, it's fine that we're staying in the same place we were in 1970. It's really not okay. We really do have to change the situation. And I think Americans understand that they need to get more education. Today, the percentage of our high school cohort, or you can just think of it as the percentage of people who are 18 years old in any given year, that attempts to go to college is at an all-time high. More than 80% of people will attempt to do post-secondary education in the United States. But I just told you that student achievement hasn't changed since 1970. So a lot of those people are not college ready. And by college ready, I don't mean they could get into Stanford ready. I mean they're unlikely to, when we say college ready, we mean you're not going to fail out of your freshman year. Okay, at a normal post-secondary institution that's non-selective in the United States. We're not talking about a Stanford here. We're talking about just a normal, non-selective post-secondary institution. You're not going to fail out. Well, we have a graduation rate for BAs and associate's degrees that is really not much higher than it was in 1970, even though 80% of the cohort is now attempting post-secondary education. So people know they need more education, but people are not getting through it. And we really have to change that. And a lot of the change needs to occur in K through 12 education because that's where the lack of college readiness is coming from. So I've talked about things that I thought are not very promising. I want to leave time for others to speak. But when we do the next round, I really want to talk about not only some of the things that we think are more promising these days. As I say, I don't think there are silver bullets. But also, I want to talk about some of the things that Stanford in particular can do, and Stanford alumni can do, and Stanford students can do, because I think they're right there. Finally, I just want to say that I think Frank made some very important points. Children are not just whatever happens to them in school. Children are what happens to them at home. And most of the data suggests that families have an influence on children that is much greater than schools can have on children. And therefore, a lot of building skill in the American population is not just about having better schools for children, but it is about having families that support our children. And I'm not going to talk about that, but I did want to just have a shout out to Frank on that point.
Great. Michelle?
Well, it's interesting over the course of the recession and getting to know a lot of these cities across the country and counties where the budget collapses locally. It brings you back to the kinds of questions that we all had in kind of basic political theory settings in which we think about what the social contract is, what we expect from government. And I think it forces us to reconsider and recommit to a very, very serious project of education reform as one wing of basic services and personal safety, sort of what we need from modern policing to ensure lower levels of violence in our high poverty cities. And so I have really sort of come back to the base of those sort of basic services of sort of police, fire, and education, and sort of the project of rebuilding those services in ways that are empirically driven by sort of what actually works in those fields, and also really serious about the enormous divergence in quality across cities, across zip codes in the country. And it's interesting, you know, there's been a lot of research recently about some of these questions. I mean, in the public finance debates, which we won't get into today, there are some really hard questions about how much we pay public employees and public debates about public employment more broadly. But you know, one thing that I've come back to in the context of policing I think is important to discuss here, which is that actually our model for compensating police officers, and by the way, I shouldn't say it's our model, it's a local model, it's not a sort of more centralized kind of federal vision, it's simply what local police departments can afford to pay their public safety officers, is exactly the opposite of what we would expect a kind of hazard pay model to look like. So in other words, the top 50 cities across the country where it is most rewarding financially to be a police officer in terms of all in, your overtime, your wages, and your pension, your lifetime earnings, is much, much better in low crime cities. You can earn a lot more money being a police officer in Palo Alto, one of the highest policed jurisdictions in the country, than you ever could in our 3 bankrupt cities in California. And when you compare these numbers sort of right in the same metro area, it's pretty extraordinary. I mean, you can earn approximately, you know, something like 50% more being a police officer in Ann Arbor than you can in Flint. Those are in the same metro area, you know, approximately the same cost of living because you can choose to commute to either. And so it's the exact opposite of a hazard pay system. And as we watch, I mean, I come from the law school, as we watch the very important, very compelling questions about modern policing, it reminds us that we need actually the best, most careful, most sensitive, most culturally capable police officers in some of the highest crime cities. And we are sort of stumbling our way in the name of local autonomy and in the name of kind of local rights, we're stumbling our way to some version of the opposite of that system. So I think that's a huge concern. So I have really come back to this basic question of how we rebuild those basic services. And I would just add one more dimension to it, which is that we have a lot of aging cities across the country. As we all know, so many people in this audience will be from historic parts of the United States. There's this whole world. I mean, it's something we don't like to think about, but there's a whole world of underground utilities in those cities that is just simply aging out. We have an enormous infrastructure backlog in this country, and it is, you know, in San Francisco, we just rebuilt our sewer system because we can afford to do it, but in Allegheny County and Pittsburgh, they can't afford to do it. And so herein, I'm marking what I predict to be one of the next major bankruptcies in the United States is Allegheny County, as it faces an enormous bill for rebuilding its entire sewage infrastructure simply because it's old and subject to modernization, and they are currently flushing raw sewage into the mighty rivers of Pittsburgh. They have an enormous project, a multi-billion-dollar bill that is heading down the pipe to them, and we have to figure out how to pay for it. And there is a, you know, you can get through a few decades of sort of kicking that can down the road, and you can go to investment banks for more complicated, what are often called exotic financing instruments to try and make those projects cheaper. But those too, some of those most exotic financing instruments blew up in the Great Recession in ways that really teach us to be cautious about solving our infrastructure deficits through fancy loan products that are high risk, may win, but if they lose, as it was said in Detroit lost catastrophically on its bet on swap derivatives. That was in the words of the bankruptcy judge. So we have an enormous sort of, we have a lot of work to do to sort of rebuild basic services and to pay down what we owe on the aging of American infrastructure.
Well, Frank, you've written a lot about the importance of a functional state. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or the whole range of other possibilities.
Well, Larry, with your permission, I'm actually going to not give you this list of things I think we ought to do. You know, I've been around public policy institutions my whole life, and my experience is, you know, you come up with this bullet list of things that we ought to be doing, and then nothing happens, because basically you don't have the political support to do anything. So I actually want to talk about the politics of inequality and poverty. Okay. So most democratic theorists believe that a high degree of inequality is not good for democracy, and I think there's a lot of evidence for that. If you don't believe that, you should look at Latin America. Latin America is the region with the highest income inequality of any other region in the world, and what it produces is this highly dysfunctional politics of the sort that's been playing out in countries like Venezuela and Argentina, Bolivia, so forth. Highly polarized politics where you've got a kind of oligarchic, conservative group, and then you've got a populist politician like Hugo Chavez that wants to do massive redistribution in a way that basically kills the goose that's laying the golden egg. So that's one model. In Europe, the problem is a little bit different because it doesn't come from the lowest strata of the society. It really comes from kind of lower middle-class people who are fearful that they're going to be drawn down into poverty. And so now every European country, including the most prosperous ones, has got a populist, anti-immigrant, anti-EU political party that recruits really from that stratum. So the National Front in France, basically most of the people that vote for Marine Le Pen were former communist voters who are working class and are very fearful of losing their status. So democracy is supposed to, in the long run, self-correct a lot of these problems. If it's the case that you get a rent-seeking elite that is coming away with most of the earnings because you've got one person, one vote, there should be a corrective. And I think in this respect, the United States, and so I guess this is a way of saying that not all populism is a bad thing, right? After the Great Depression, you had a certain form of American populism that created the New Deal coalition that put together the underpinnings of the modern American welfare state under Franklin Roosevelt and so forth. Right now, you've got this very weird situation in the United States. So the white working class, as I just indicated, has not been doing well. Their incomes have been rising very, very slowly. They're suffering from all of this social breakdown. You would think after the big crisis of 2008, 2009, that there'd be this big left-wing populist upsurge where people are angry at Wall Street bankers and so forth. And instead, the biggest populist movement in the United States is the Tea Party, where you get, mostly white voters, a lot of them quite rural, who vote for Republican candidates whose policies basically have not been in their long-term, interests. It's very amusing because, it's not amusing, it's kind of sad, but, one of the biggest beneficiaries of Obamacare are actually rural white relative working class people, let's say in the Deep South, who didn't have access to health care, and they vote for politicians that want to, abolish Obamacare. So it's a very, and the left has really been pretty much absent. You have the Occupy movement, which I think is just a bunch of kids. It's really not, it's not a deeply rooted movement. So what's going on in American politics? And I think it's a couple of different things. So one is that it has been really, really hard for the left to capture that white working class. Ronald Reagan did this historical turnabout where they had been part of the New Deal coalition. He captured them for the Republican Party, got reelected twice, and then the elder Bush once. Bill Clinton managed to be president because he managed to get a fair number of those, including some in the South, back voting for the Democrats. Since then, basically the Democrats have given up on that demographic, and they split their vote. Some of them continue to vote, pro-union for the Democrats, but a lot of them are pretty solidly Republican. I think that this is, because of cultural issues, essentially, that group has these economic interests, but they care more about guns, patriotism, abortion, these sorts of issues than they do about narrow their own economic self-interest. So this gets back, and then on the Democratic Party side, you've got this big problem because the Democratic Party has been largely consumed by identity politics, and gender, ethnicity, and race have trumped class, social class. So the big lesson I would take away from the last 30 years is actually our class problem is actually much more serious, a divide in the United States, than any of those, ethnicity, race, or gender, because in all of those categories, you see the same big divide between people that are doing well in terms of educational attainment and those that are not. But the politics, does not match that particular social division. And you could see this in Bernie Sanders' campaign. I mean, he wanted to raise the class issue as the centerpiece of his form of populism. And as the campaign has been continuing, he's found himself being torn by the environmentalists and the feminists and the people that worry about Black Lives Matter, and that class message in the end is ending up quite diluted. So we live in a weird country. It's
Jesper, what about the other countries?
Start with the weird ones, then go to the regular.
Yeah, thank you. So I thought, Frank, you usually talk about the importance of getting to Denmark as kind of the role model. And since I'm from Denmark, I really wanted that line, and so I'm a little disappointed that I wasn't fed it. So,
you just uttered it.
So, right. So, no, I worked it in. Thank you. So what I would say, I think the unfortunate truth about the challenges, again, in a lot of developing countries, right? So why is it that South Korea, right, did so much better than Ghana, right, over that period, right? So part of it is because of as I said earlier, a lot of it was state-led, which doesn't mean that the state ran all the factories, right, or ran all the companies, but rather that they created all the underlying institutions and infrastructure that made it possible for entrepreneurs to succeed in those contexts. So I think all the problems that Caroline and Michelle have described, right, in terms of the problems of decline in the United States and a lot of those supporting infrastructures, right? There is no decline necessarily in a lot of these developing economies because it just hasn't existed. So I think you get an added degree of difficulty, right? Because I think in the end, right, this is about, and the way we think about it at Seed is really, we focus very much on this challenge of how do you get firms to be more productive, right? So how do you get firms, right, to be able to contribute and grow and scale in such a way that they create jobs, right? And jobs, I think, it's underestimated how important jobs are for a lot of these problems here. Now, obviously, they're also, to get the jobs, you need a lot of the institutional supports that we talk here. But there's, great research that's been done where people do surveys of the very poor in countries like India and in the various African countries. And they ask the parents, what are your hopes for your children? What would you like your children to grow up to be? And you would think, given the popularity, especially of microfinance and other kinds of innovations like that over the last 20 years, that they would say entrepreneurship, like this is what Silicon Valley parents say, right? It's like, I want my kid to start Facebook because that would make my life a lot better, right? And so, but really what they say is, I wish my child could have a job at the post office, right? And that's not because they love mail, right? And it's because what they want is their fondest hope for their kids is to have a stable, predictable job that's there every day, every week, every month. It doesn't mean that you get to keep it for life, but there's some predictability in it. The lives of the poor in developing economies are typically lives where they have You know, they're entrepreneurial, right, but they're necessity entrepreneurs. So they're doing 3 different kinds of little self-employment kinds of gigs as a way of making ends meet. And because they're doing so many different things, they don't specialize. They don't develop a set of skills. They don't get better at one particular thing because they're always running from making, you know, little chapatis in the morning to going and cleaning somebody's house to driving a tuk-tuk or something like that. And they never get the depth of skills. They never develop the specialized human capital that they need to really be able to succeed. What people need are jobs, because jobs allow you, if you have that idea that your job is going to be there 6 months from now, you can imagine a career inside an organization. You can start to plan for the future. You can start to think about setting aside a little money to invest in your children's education. You are more tolerant of the taxes that you pay because you can see that they are returned to you in some way in terms of public services and other kinds of things. And so for us, if we think about really what it is that has made a difference, right, in the countries that did make that shift, right, it was that firms were able, right, to grow and to develop and to become stable, right? So if you think about all the companies, just try to imagine, right, like all of you are here for your reunions. Just think about the companies that you knew about when you were in college, and then think about the names of the companies that you know about now, right? We now take for granted a company like Samsung, right? Or we take for granted, you know, Huawei from China or any other number of companies, right? That's what you're looking for, and we want, you know, I think in 30 years we want you to know the names of the companies from Africa and from India and other kinds of places where there still is extreme poverty. And so the puzzle, right, and the challenge is, how do you do that? So some of that is about, you know, technology transfer, right? And so like these countries benefit enormously from the fact that knowledge, right, about how to do things and machinery and all these other kinds of things flows much more easily across country national borders than it used to. But the way we focus on it as also what's really important is the really important technology is a management technology and a leadership technology. So you can buy a big piece of equipment, right? And you can maybe get the money to invest in a big piece of equipment. But if you don't know how to manage the workers who are going to run that piece of equipment to do it productively, right? It's just going to be, it's not going to be productive, right? So, and that actually creates a bottleneck, right? Because there are people who want to invest in those, right? So I talked earlier about people think that Africa is going to be where manufacturing is going next, right? So there are investors, global investors, who want to invest in manufacturing in Africa, but they don't have the confidence that the companies will be run and be able to succeed. And some of that is because of the infrastructure and the institutions, but some of that is also about the basic kind of leadership and management kind of skills that are needed to run a modern kind of complex organization. And and this is obvious for SEED is housed at the GSB, right, in the business school.
I'm going to come back to the
and so
SEED
that's
in just
part
a
of why
Okay.
we focus on that, but I do think it's a really important part of that story.
All right, so that's the perfect segue into the third round of my questioning, which is about how Stanford can make a difference, both as a university and as a broader community of public-spirited individuals. Let me just say, since they're not on the stage today, I do want to acknowledge the work of the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality. We have some literature out there in the lobby about them. They're one of 3 national poverty centers designated by the Department of Health and Human Services, and they are innovating in the use of big data to modernize our national infrastructure for monitoring poverty and inequality and for evaluating poverty and inequality programs. So let's talk about our work, our innovation, our action, our engagement with communities and our research, and learn about what Stanford is doing. And since you mentioned it, why don't we start with you, Jesper, and the SEED program at the business school.
Go first, is that okay? So at SEED, what we're doing a lot of really exciting things. So we were founded 4 years ago, almost exactly, right, with a very generous gift from Bobby and Dottie King. And really the mission of SEED is to end the cycle of global poverty by enabling business leaders in developing economies to lead their regions out of poverty. So we're really squarely focused on that problem, right? How do we enable these leaders to be able to grow their firms and to create the innovative goods and services that are really going to drive economic growth? We do that in lots of different ways. So the way we think about it is we operate on multiple time horizons. So we kind of we make investments that operate kind of basically on a long-term time horizon. So we fund basic research here on campus, right, that is around really the complex interdependencies. So a lot of the things that you've heard here about the way all these different processes interact in really complicated and interesting for academics kinds of ways, right? We really try to seed really interesting projects, right, that'll tackle that in a big way and in a really productive and novel way. And sort of our goal in the research dimension is to really put Stanford on the map, right, as a premier institution for thinking about the complex challenges related to global poverty. We also work on an intermediate time horizon, so where we think about, right, the investments that we're making will pay off, where in research they pay off, you know, maybe 2 decades down the road, right? We think of in the intermediate time horizon, we really focus on students, right? And so we think about giving Stanford students, undergraduates, MBAs, master's students, PhD students, giving them the opportunities and the exposure to what the challenges are for businesses in particular in developing economies. And so we have a great internship program that we run, so currently with a lot of the companies we work with in West Africa, where Stanford undergraduates and Stanford master's students, many of them MBA students, spend 6 to 8 weeks working side by side with leaders and entrepreneurs who are facing the challenges of trying to grow their business, right? So they're established companies, they have an idea, this is not a startup, right? They've got something that works, right? But they're having trouble figuring out how to get to the next level, right? How do I delegate? How do I empower my employees to really have this enterprise grow to a much bigger level? Those students come back and they think about what those challenges are in a very different way. So I think it's very easy when you live in this incredibly beautiful environment here to imagine that, well, people in developing economies, they don't really know what they're doing and so on and so forth, right? They come back and that is not the lesson, right? They draw the exact opposite lesson. They're unbelievably impressed by all the hurdles that these entrepreneurs have to come and the challenges that they come. And just think about, to get to the level of success that you would see, and you think in the United States, you say, oh, that's a pretty good job, right? And how much more effort it takes to get there in Ghana or Nigeria just because of the obstacles you face. And then the final part that we do in the more sort of intermediate or immediate impact, right? So really the short-term impact is we work with companies, right? We work with leaders who are in developing economies. So we currently run a center in Accra, Ghana, where we train business leaders, right? So it's about a 6-month program. They go through 4 intensive weeks where they're taught by Stanford faculty. The most important part of that program, though, I think, is that we provide coaching, right? So the thing that we're really concerned about is, one thing is classroom learning, right? It's great. We can provide a great classroom experience. We have the best faculty in the world. We know that we can do that. But then the question is, when you leave that classroom and you go back to your business, does anything change, right? Because as soon as you get back to the business, you're back to the obstacles that you were facing and that you've been overcome, and you go straight back into firefighting mode. So how do we help these leaders actually take the ideas that they get passionate about in the classroom and implement them in their organizations? And so we have, and this is my pitch to you, we have alumni, right, who go and they volunteer and they move to Ghana, right? And they spend 6 to 12 months, right, on a volunteer basis working with 5 to 6 companies, hand in hand, working with these leaders, right? And helping them really walk, right, that journey, right? So really to go down that path and learn, right, what does it mean to be an effective leader, right? When does it mean, when is it good to let go and delegate, and when do you actually have to intervene? Those are incredibly hard things for any leader to try to figure out. And what we do is we try to tap on the experience and the knowledge of Stanford alumni in particular, and people who want to give back, right, and bring them into that conversation, and I think it's an incredibly powerful opportunity. And we'll be expanding to East Africa next spring.
Great. Oh, since we're on the global theme, Frank, you want to say anything about?
Well, just very briefly, some of the most innovative social programs and methods for controlling violence have actually not been invented in the United States. They've been invented in places like Latin America. So Mexico pioneered something called the conditional cash transfer program, which basically gives subsidies to poor people based on whether their children are in school and gives them an incentive to put them in school. In policing, the city of Medellin, Colombia, I don't know if any of you have been watching this Narcos series on Netflix, but about Pablo Escobar, but it's amazing. Colombia solved that problem. I hate to give away season 2, but the Colombians actually solved the problem of extreme violence in their country through a very innovative, set of mixing social programs with different types of policing methods. And so we have a poverty and governance program at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law that is actually looking at some of these because, in fact, some of these programs, I kind of think that Americans have been brain dead on social policy for the last, 20, 30 years. And sometimes, there are other countries that have had ideas that have had measurable success that could be generalized to other parts of the world. So I think that's an important contribution.
Yeah, and it's great when we can send our undergraduate honor students out there and our Haas Center undergraduate fellows to actually work on some of these problems. Caroline, what about the educational sphere?
So I want to talk about some solutions now, and I want to talk about what Stanford can do, and I'm going to give you all a to-do list. First, what is our first responsibility as a university? It is actually to produce great students and give them a really rigorous education. Why? Because our economy depends quite disproportionately on students like our students, and if we want to have economic growth, which at the end of the day is the single most important thing that pulls people out of poverty, we're going to have a lot of very skilled people coming out of universities like this because we do generate a lot of innovation and a lot of technological growth, and we just fill a lot of the high-skilled jobs in this country. So that's our first responsibility, is just to educate students really well. I think our second responsibility is to ensure, along with our peer institutions and other educational organizations in the United States, that every child who has a high level of student achievement at the end of high school is able to go to a post-secondary institution that provides a really high quality education. Every child, and I don't just mean poor children, but I mean middle-class children, lower middle-class children, working class, every child who manages to attain that level of student achievement. Now you might think, oh, we've done all of that. Actually, that's not true. My own research shows that there are 8 to 9 times as many low-income high achievers in the United States as currently go to a selective college or university at all. And I'm not talking about the most selective colleges. I'm talking about like the top 200, 250 most selective colleges in the United States. Many of them they're high achievers. They're in the top 10% of students in the US, and they are not going to a selective college or university. They are not getting the kind of rigorous education that they are perfectly capable of getting. And when they do go to institutions like this, they pay less because, as you know, we make education free, and many other institutions also make education very low cost for low-income students, but they also thrive, they do very well. This is not a matter of, it's really not a matter of affirmative action, which people like to talk about. This is a matter of our ensuring that every child who is able to be a high achiever has great opportunities, and they know about the opportunities they have. Now, so there are 2 ways to solve this problem. One of them, I think, is the university's responsibility and college organizations' responsibility, and that is to do admissions and recruiting in a way that's much more analytic in the future and much more data-driven, and I'm not, that's the kind of stuff I do. But that's not my to-do list for you. My to-do list for you is that you all live in areas where there are some high schools that do not have very many high achievers, but they have some high achievers. It might only be 1 or 2 or 3 high achievers. They're not all very low-income high schools. They might just be working class, blue-collar, middle-class high schools. But those students who are very high achievers often do not make it through the college application process at selective colleges and universities because it's complicated and it requires a lot of steps, and very few other students in the high school are going through the same type of college application process. Go to your local high schools, not an affluent one with helicopter parents, please. Go to a local high school and volunteer to say, I will take your 2 or 3 or 4 very high achievers who might be able to go to a selective college university, and I will guide them. I will make sure they get through this college application process. I will read their application essays. I will bug them when they haven't gotten their teacher's letters of recommendation. I will make sure that they actually take the test that they need to take on time. We do that for our most well-educated parents do that for their children. Not all parents have that capacity to do that for their children. So if every Stanford alum did that, it would make a huge difference in the United States. We would have a lot more high achievers go to selective colleges and universities. And it's totally possible. You can do it. You're not going to be overwhelmed. Okay. Yes. And then the last thing I want to talk about is American K-12 education and what we can do about that. Well, one of the things that we know does really matter in American public schools or private schools, all schools, is teachers matter. Okay? We have a lot of evidence that the difference between high-performing and low-performing teachers is enormous, that there are some teachers who teach something like 3 years of math or English or something else in 1 year, and other teachers who, frankly, have mildly negative effects on student achievement. So there's this enormous range. And we want to put talented people in American classrooms, and that is a difficult thing to do, because although teacher pay on average in the United States is not low, the starting pay of teachers is low. Most of the returns to teaching are in the forms of pensions that people get, later in life, or in the form of seniority pay that you get after 20 or 30 years. Okay, so starting as a starting teacher in the United States, you're not going to make a whole lot of money. And most schools pay people in this sort of lockstep way. Well, what could we do in the short term to put more talented teachers into schools? I really think programs like Teach for America are a great idea. Not only do they put some very talented people in front of students in the United States who are from disadvantaged backgrounds, but they also change those communities by having very well-educated people who go to very selective colleges there in these schools, and that changes what students see as being their opportunities. I think that's important. And then the third thing that's important about that is that most Teach for America teachers, they teach for a couple of years, and then they go on to another career, but their lives have been changed by the fact that they have encountered the American public education system. And many of them have become our greatest school superintendents, school leaders, reformers, and they will change American public education. I think that's important. I would love to see Teach for America inundated by Stanford students who say, I want to do my 2 years of public service, and I want to do it through a program like Teach for America. I'd love to see every charter school in the United States be deluged by Stanford alumni. So we'll see.
Great. Michelle?
So this is a question, sort of the role for Stanford is something that I think all of us think about a lot as teachers here, not just as scholars outside of the campus, but as teachers. Sort of what does it mean to educate, to be part of the education of Stanford students? And it's tricky for me because from within Stanford, the world looks very wealthy and very peaceful. And that's a wonderful thing. We have a lot of low-income students who come to Stanford, and I want that peaceful refuge for them. I think it's actually really lovely to see them sort of exhale when they get here. But the larger educational mission for all of the students who have lived peaceful lives before Stanford and will live them after Stanford has to be broader. And I guess I would describe it, or my struggle in teaching is sort of to help my students get outside Stanford and help them get under Stanford. So by outside Stanford, I mean sort of around the world, outside of the wealth of the Silicon Valley suburbs, to see the depth of poverty within California, to see the depth of rural poverty within California. I feel a special duty to students who come to higher ed in California to see what farm work is like in California. It's a huge part of our economy, and it is a place of tremendous need. So getting them outside Stanford is part of it, and then getting them under Stanford is part of it too, because as all of us know, there is this teeming world of invisible low-wage work under the Silicon Valley economy. And it's the sort of service class of the Silicon Valley economy. And And so having students understand sort of the restaurant industry, not just as a kind of hipster pleasure in lovely San Francisco, but as a sort of an economic condition is incredibly important. So we have to find ways to do that, and the Cardinal Service Initiative is so ambitious and so special, and I think it actually has to be, because of where our students come to college and where they come to law school, where they come to higher ed. I think it has to be that extensive, that serious, and that ambitious, because we have a special burden as part of our students going out into the world, not just as leaders and business professionals and so forth, but also as voters, for them to understand sort of the conditions outside of their most immediate lived experience. So that's what Larry tries to do.
Michael?
Well, I would strongly endorse everything that's been said prior to my remarks, and so I'll just leave it at that. I would say and so I would also hope that a very large fraction of Stanford students would avail themselves of these various opportunities that the previous speakers have mentioned. But I want to focus on two other aspects which I think Stanford is doing and needs to continue to do. And it relates to the difference between retail and wholesale making these changes. It's great to have people, entrepreneurs out in various places, and a lot more Teach for America people. That is absolutely fundamental and important. But it's also important to change the institutions and the policies in a lot of places. And we train a lot of students in a lot of disciplines, my own and Caroline's economics being an important example from my perspective, that actually wind up taking the skills they have there and whatever interpersonal skills they develop along the way, and then go on to positions where they actually have a chance to change something. Running the IMF, being dean of the major business school in China, being finance ministers, central bankers, and things of that sort. I think that is really, really important, and it's complementary to harnessing the energy and idealism to do something specific to serve some specific people. But I think we shouldn't lose that fundamental importance of what we do here in educating broadly and also training in some depth in a discipline, whether that's biology or economics or whatever it happens to be, our students who are just terrific in this regard, because they're going to use those skills. And I would also have kind of an economist's notion of the option value of that. The deeper and more thorough your knowledge and your mastery of at least the basics of some of these disciplines, the greater the opportunity you'll have at some point in your life. It may not be as soon as you graduate. You may have other things you need to do for various reasons. But the opportunity that you will have to step in at some point in your life and do something that helps to make a big difference in a place, on, as I put it, the wholesale level as well as the retail level. I think that is really fundamental to what we do at Stanford, and I think it is something that I've seen in my own department, economics, change for the better over the years. And we now have a lot more people with interests in the policy-relevant areas. While they're well-tooled in analytical economics and statistics, they have interest in these policy-relevant areas where we need to change the policies. Now, I'm not naive enough to say that it's just something that'll be drawn up on a PowerPoint slide from class to the mouth of your student who then goes out and does something. There are these deeply embedded problems, especially in other parts of the world, but also in the US, of the clash of different interests, the way political institutions do or don't or can't mediate them, and outright corruption in many parts of the world. So it's important, but I think it's really important that we have over time and over their lifetime that we're educating and equipping a large number of our students to be able to take some time out, whether it's a local school board, whether it's in Sacramento or in Washington, or in Frankfurt, wherever it happens to be, or in Beijing. We're training a lot of students that can actually go and have a disproportionate influence to just one person in that situation. So I would just say, I hope you all had a sense of some of that during your education here, and I hope when you come back to your next reunion, you'll think we're doing even a better job.
Great. Well, I'm in this dilemma where I've got about 2.5 minutes left, and I hope you will forgive me for our not having the time to go to the audience. But so let me finish this session by asking you each very briefly, because I know I've read a lot of the questions that came from people who are watching this webcast, and I've talked to some of the people who I know are in the audience. I know people feel frustrated. I know there's almost a sense of despair about our politics now and about the intractability of the issues. So in something like 30 seconds each, give them something hopeful that you see happening. Caroline?
You know, I actually think there are, I work in education policy a lot. And most education policy solutions are really not about Republicans and Democrats. Most of us believe that Americans should be educated. Most of us believe there should be equal educational opportunities. Most of us believe that it's a great thing for people to have skills and get ahead. These are just not politically, they should not be politically divisive issues. And lots of the, I will just say that lots of the time when I go to talk to policymakers, what I am proposing is a solution that has no political side to it and is also easy. Okay, not every problem is easy, but you know, for instance, I went to Washington, D.C. the other day and I proposed a solution for a $30 billion program of our tax deductions and credits for higher education that is as easy as rewriting one sentence in the law. Okay, and it is not hard, and we're already spending the $30 billion. So there are lots of easy solutions out there, and I think that's part of what we need to go after.
One of my favorite articles about American politics in the last few years was written by former Republican Congressman Mickey Edwards. The title is How to Turn Republicans and Democrats into Americans Again. Okay, Frank?
Well, I just think that people ought, I mean, in a way this follows on what Michael was saying earlier. The world actually has been getting better if you look over the last 30, 40 years in terms of development and in terms of solutions to problems. And I think you can get very focused on, you know, short-term issues that we all face, but there are actually a lot of, you know, there's been a lot of innovation in policy. And so I would just keep your sights on that big picture rather than, you know, getting too despairing about the short term.
Jesper?
So I would agree with Frank. I mean, I think, you know, so I've gone on a number of study trips with MBA students to various developing countries, and we visit all these fascinating little social enterprise and startups and businesses and so on and so forth. And God bless the MBA students, they always walk away, they say, yeah, but it'll never scale, right? And because they all want the next Facebook, and so that's good, right? That's good. That's what we want in our MBA students. But I have to remind them is those little things, right? Even if they don't, you know, become the global dominant social enterprise, they still make a real difference. And I think I think that just reinforces Frank's point, right? The little things matter as well, and going out and helping a kid apply for college, I think that makes a huge difference as well.
Michelle?
Well, you know, I'm at the law school, and so a lot of what lawyers do is think about kind of who is responsible, you know, defendants, plaintiffs, you know, whose fault is it? And so much of American politics has that character now, too, of sort of blame and responsibility. And I think it is quite paralyzing. It's quite immobilizing to just ask sort of who do we point the finger at, who do we blame, and then if you can't conclusively answer that, you're sort of absolved of reform. And I think what I really see, and I see this longing in my students, is just to roll up their sleeves and just get busy anyway. So even if you can't, you know, conclusively figure out sort of whose fault it is, you still have a lot of work to do. And I think we just, you know, and it has to be based on the best available evidence, and then you just move forward. So I think that's what we're trying to teach our students at Stanford, and maybe it'll sort of make things less divisive.
Quickly, Michael.
I would just say against these problems, we have many strengths in America. We have the best higher education system in the world. We have a population that's much more supportive of earned success. We have the best entrepreneurs, despite the problems recently, and that continue to be fixed. We have the deepest, most liquid capital markets. We have a highly productive labor force that's under strain, especially as we project it forward from the K through 12 education shortfall. But we have a lot of assets to array against this. When we look back at our history, In the 1960s, there was massive fear of automation. The lucky few would key punch for IBM, the rest of us would be structurally unemployed. Never happened. 1970s, there was a ruinous combination of high inflation and deep recession simultaneously, stagflation. We licked that. In the 1980s was competition from Japan. In the end, they wind up buying high and selling low in Pebble Beach and Rockefeller Center. And more recently, it's been China, et cetera. I think we have the ability to overcome all these things, and I think in the end we will, but it won't be pretty. I think that we can make progress on all of our problems. They won't be perfect solutions. They won't be what any of us draw up on the blackboard, but I think we wind up making progress, maybe in fits and starts. And in the end, if you want an optimistic note, just remember what Winston Churchill said about America and Americans. They'll eventually do the right thing after they've exhausted all the other alternatives.
Well,
Ladies and gentlemen, please, another round of applause for our moderator and our panelists.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.